Hi everyone, welcome to this very nice webinar about the problem of predatory publishing and how the industry is responding with Simon Lineker, Marketing Director at Cabells. Let me just change this so we can have our presentation on the screen. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. Today, I also have the privilege to have Valeria Garcia, Vice President for Emerald, Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, let me share about this platform, GoToWebinar. Please, you can use the window in your right-hand side to send us questions. Microphones and cameras are off, so there is more band for us all to listen to our guest speaker today. In this first part, we have Valeria to start the session. Then in the second part, I will invite Simon, and there will be time for questions and answers in the third and last part of this webinar. Now I want to invite Valeria Garcia, our Vice President for Emerald, Latin America and the Caribbean, to share some words for us. Valeria, please.
Thank you, Andre. First, I'd like to welcome Simon and thank him for being here with us today, for accepting our invitation. Thank you, Simon. I'm sure this will be a great opportunity for us to speak more about research of ethics. It's always an important area to reinforce and also to learn more about this. Also to thank Andre and all the team for putting all these presentations together, the webinars. I also invite all to follow us in our social media for the next webinars that we are planning. You are all welcome. And I'd like to wish all the attendees an excellent session. And again, thank you for my colleague, someone that I appreciate very much. He's an expert in this field. Simon, thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Valeria. Now I want to invite our dear guest speaker to share. It's on the screen already. Simon Lineker, Marketing Director at Cabells. Simon spent 15 years in publishing at Emerald, where he had direct experience in journal acquisitions, open access, and business development. His background is in journalism, and he has been published in academic journals on the topics of biometrics, publication ethics, and knowledge transfer. He holds master's degrees in philosophy and international business and has global experience lecturing to researchers on publishing strategies. Simon also serves as trustee for the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE. Simon, thank you for accepting this invitation. It's a pleasure to have you. The session is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andre. So let me just check that the slides work. Yes. Okay, so in today's session, so I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes or so on the topic of predatory publishing, and then we'll have plenty of opportunity for another 10 or 15 minutes to have some questions at the end of the session. So just to give you an overview, firstly, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Cabells and what Cabells does, and my own personal background and interest in the topic. I'm going to define for you what exactly predatory publishing is and give you a little bit of the history of predatory publishing and how it developed. I'll show you some examples of what a predatory journal actually looks like, and share some of the reasons why predatory journals are, in particular, potentially quite damaging to scholarly communications and how they may impact on researchers' work. We'll look at how predatory journals they trick authors and give them a false sense of security in terms of the journals that they think they're publishing in. And then we'll look at some strategies about how to avoid predatory journals. So we'll look at Cabells strategy, which is our predatory reports database, but also other strategies that you can use to help you avoid publishing and falling into the trap of predatory journals. So firstly, as Andre said, I've been working in academic publishing for nearly 20 years. And when I was at Emerald, then I was one of the people that developed an interest in publication ethics and looked at the problem of predatory journals and how it impacted on a publisher like Emerald. But Emerald, there was one or two instances, for example, where we had somebody who hijacked an Emerald journal, which we managed to stop quite quickly. But it was a major issue in the industry and has been, as we'll see, for quite some time. It's interesting that my background before academic publishing was in journalism, and obviously in journalism at the moment we have the issue of fake news, which most of you will probably have heard of, and there are some parallels between the issues of fake news and basically trust in media that are shared with predatory journals, because predatory journals, like fake news, they're trying to create and develop a trust or a connection with a reader, but by doing that, they are actually effectively lying to the reader. They're deceiving the reader for their own gains. And we'll look at how predatory journals try to undermine the work of researchers and like I said, try to deceive researchers and why they do that. And it may be interesting for you to know that I'm currently researching and writing a book on predatory publishing, which will hopefully be published early next year. And this will actually be an open access book, so it will be available for everybody to download and read if you have more interest in the topic. But it's been quite useful because I've used the research for the book to share some of the insights today with you all. Now, you may or may not have heard of Cabells. So Cabells is actually quite a well-established company. Cabells is based in Texas in the United States, and it is over 40 years old. And Cabells started life as a project by our owner, Dr. Dave Cabell. He was a professor at a university in Texas, and he set his post-grad students onto a project, and the project was to collate as much data as possible, as much relevant data as possible on the best business and management journals. And from that project, he was able to pull all the information together and publish a book or a directory of the best business and management journals. And his idea was that authors in business and management, they often didn't have the right information to make an informed decision about where they wanted to publish. So he wanted to pull all of that information together and offer it in a book for business and management authors. And the same ethos applies today, but we've grown considerably over the years. So now we have two databases of information on journals for that submission decision, to help people make the right decision about submitting their articles for publication. We've got one database called Journalytics. So this currently has over 11,000 good quality journals, which span most disciplines. Up until recently, we didn't include medical, but we're actually hoping to launch a new medical product either at the end of this year or the beginning of next year. And that will give us around 17,000 journals. But what we're going to talk about today involves our second product, which is called Predatory Reports. This was a database that we launched just over 4 years ago. Some of you may have heard of Beals List. We'll talk a little bit more about Beals List shortly. But essentially, when Beals List closed, we had the good fortune to be ready to launch our product just after he closed his list. And we now include over 15,000 predatory journals. So by developing, launching, maintaining, growing that database, we have come to know an awful lot about predatory journals, and that's what we want to share with you today. So when we've worked with researchers, and we were speaking to researchers as we do on a regular basis in the mid 2010, so around 2014, 2015, then one of the things that we heard consistently is that they were struggling with the rise of predatory journals. And at that time, the only real resource they had to understand and to identify predatory journals was Beals List. Beals List was created around 2009, and by 2015 it had grown in quite a size, and by 2017, when it closed, it had 1,000 journals and 1,000 publishers. Something that people perhaps don't realize about Beals List is it's actually was actually two lists, one list of journals, one list of publishers. Now, for various reasons, Beal decided to close his list down at the start of 2017. But by that stage, we had already spent a lot of time and effort researching and developing our own database of predatory journals. And there's a couple of quotes here that we've included to give you a flavour of why we thought this was the right time to launch this and to step up the fight on behalf of authors against predatory journals. So there's a very famous article, perhaps the most famous article about predatory journals, was published by Shen and Bjork in 2015. And that estimated that the previous year, in 2014, there were around 420,000 articles available through predatory journals in around 8,000 active titles. And at that stage, the 8,000 titles was roughly equivalent to how many in total journals were included in Beals lists. And Beal himself felt very strongly about the potential danger that predatory journals posed, and he only saw this as growing, that research was being published and was being read and used in good faith, but it hadn't gone through peer review, and therefore, at best, the research was questionable, and at worst, it could be potentially quite dangerous. So these are the two main reasons why we thought, okay, well, Beal had done what he did, and there was a lot of people who were quite critical of Beals List because at the end of the day, it was a subjective list. It was the list that Beal himself decided to publish, and it wasn't clear what the criteria were and how he had identified the predatory journals. So before we go any further, it's probably worth understanding what a predatory journal, what it actually is. And so here we've got a quote from a recent article that was published in Nature at the end of 2019 by Grudnovich et al. So this is how they define a predatory journal. A predatory journal and publisher are entities that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship and are characterized by false or misleading information, a deviation from best editorial and publication practices, a lack of transparency, and/or the use of aggressive and indiscriminate solicitation practices. Now, this definition came about from a seminar that happened earlier in 2019 with a group of people in Canada, and they came together to agree this definition. But the definition itself has had a lot of criticism because, on the one hand, it's quite vague, and there are people who say, for example, and just for the record, I'm not involved in this, but this is something that has been quoted, that a publisher such as Elsevier that are seen to be quite aggressive in terms of their publishing strategy could potentially, depending on how you define and you understand these terms, also be defined as predatory journal. But I don't think anybody would seriously suggest that Elsevier is predatory, and I certainly wouldn't. However, there's one major element that it also completely misses out, which is peer review. Now, in our experience, the vast majority of journals that we would define as predatory don't do any peer review. And those that do peer review, often the peer review is not a robust or a substantial peer review. It's just really the briefest of checks. So we have, whilst this neatly summarizes what a predatory journal could be, it doesn't really get to the truth of the reality of what predatory journals are. So we think a better way to define a predatory journal is that it's an opportunistic publishing venue that exploits the academic need to publish, but offers little reward for those using their services with insubstantial or no peer review. So we feel this is probably a shorter and more succinct definition because it gets to the heart of the point. So firstly, predatory journals exploit what you might call the publish or perish scenario. So in other words, authors, whether they're in South America or in Europe or in Asia, to a greater or lesser extent, they all feel the need to publish, either from a sense of professional pride, because they want to disseminate their research, because their boss is telling them that they need to publish their research, because there are various rules and regulations from their governments that tell them that they need to publish, pressure from the university. All sorts of things feed into the publish or perish scenario. And predatory journals take advantage of that because they offer an easy option. If you have to publish, then publishing in a predatory journal can be quite easy. It's very cheap, it's very quick, it's very simple. And they reduce those barriers to entry and make it as easy as possible for authors to publish. But by doing that, they also remove the quality checks, and they remove all of the essence of what it is to be published. So the situation is there to be exploited, and predatory publishers have simply used that situation to make money. And this is the primary goal that predatory publishers have. So it really helps, I think, to understand why predatory publishers do what they do. What are their motivations and methods? So firstly, their goal is to make money. So they take advantage of the fact that authors increasingly are used to paying an APC or article processing charge to make their article open access. And they take advantage of that because many authors believe in good faith that they will receive a service in return from that. But in actual fact, they don't receive a service. They receive the appearance of a service. But the key things to that service are missed. So the second point is that there's no quality control. Predatory publishers don't care about quality. So they don't peer review, they don't edit the journal, they don't care about the quality, they don't change the article in any way. They simply copy and paste it into a PDF and put it on a website. They don't even publish it often. So there's no thought about the quality of the article that's being published. In order to make the authors pay the APC, they will make false claims or promises. And the most common false claim is that they will claim that the journal has an impact factor, or that it is indexed in Web of Science, Scopus, Cabells, or some other indexing service. And these are often false. Either they will say the journal has an impact factor and it simply doesn't, or they will say that it has something like a web impact factor, or sometimes we've even seen things like a Scopus impact factor, which simply doesn't exist. Nevertheless, if you are an author and you don't understand what Web of Science and impact factor actually means, but you know that it's a good thing, then you may well get tricked into submitting your article to their journal. Fourthly, these operators are, we have to be honest, they are engaged in unethical business practices. These are not nice people. Whenever there have been various operations to uncover who are behind these journals, then often the people behind these journals are also involved in other crime. They will be, for example, trafficking or money laundering, because it's a very cash-rich scam business, unethical business to be involved in. So if you do submit your article, then and you do get published and you do pay for that, then you are you're contributing to not just unethical business practices, but maybe quite dangerous and criminal business practices. And finally, they fail to follow any of the accepted standards or best practices of scholarly publishing. So one of the interesting things about predatory journals is that when in 2018 there was a big court case in the United States. So the Federal Trade Commission in the United States found the largest, or what is believed to be the largest predatory publisher, called Omics. They found them guilty of defrauding authors over a 6-year period in 700 of their journals. And the court added together all of the APCs that would have been paid for all of those articles, for all those journals, and the total came to $50 million. And so Omics was ordered to pay a fine of $50 million for defrauding academic authors of their money. Now, the reason that they found them guilty, or one of the reasons, was because they didn't follow any of the standards or best practices of scholarly publishing. So, for example, all of the journals that Omics had listed quick peer review as one of the services that they would expect to have been done when they submitted their articles, but there was no evidence provided of any peer review being done. And as a result, the Federal Trade Commission found that the Omics was guilty of defrauding authors because they were selling them a service that they did not provide. And that's one of the reasons why they had such a big fine. So the motivation here is clear. The motivation is cash, because authors can pay often up to $1,000 or $2,000 to publish their article in a predatory journal. Often the money is not theirs, it will be from a funder, so it's quite easy for them to simply move those funds from the research account to the predatory publisher's account, and it can be done quite quickly. So on the one side, it's very cash rich, and on the other side, it's very cheap, because if you don't do anything that publishers do, you simply put a PDF onto a website and make it open access, then that's actually very, very cheap to do, because none of the infrastructure and none of the service costs are involved in that. So this is the major motivation for the predatory publishers to do what they do. So this is how the scam works, and part of the reason why predatory journals have been quite successful is that often there's a lot of confusion out there amongst authors about exactly which journals are predatory, which ones are legitimate. For example, some people think that open access journals are predatory, or in some way suspicious, because predatory journals, 99% of predatory journals are also open access. But that's not true. Predatory journals exploit the open access model, but just because they exploit the open access model has got nothing to do with open access. Open access itself, as many of you in South America know, who have dealt over many years with open access journals, there's nothing inherently wrong or inherently suspicious about open access, quite the opposite in fact. But the problem is that predatory journals have taken advantage of the model and exploited it for financial gain. So this is the problem, and this is why I use the analogy and compared predatory journals to fake news, because everything is based on these fake claims about quick peer review and being able to turn things around in a matter of hours, and say that they have an impact factor or are indexed in various websites, but none of it's true. And so it's really been quite a big problem, and it's now been a problem for a long time. Predatory journals first started probably, and it's very difficult to identify the first open access journal, but they probably started in the early 2000s, so nearly 20 years ago, when journals first started to be created as open access and first went wholly online. Then people started to see the opportunity to make some money as a predatory journal, and there is evidence to suggest that at least going back to 2003 there were predatory journals operational, but probably before that. So if you do publish in a predatory journal, then what's the harm? And many people who think when they're asked about whether people should avoid predatory journals and what tactics and strategies they should adopt to avoid them, some people will say, don't bother. What's the harm in publishing in a predatory journal? Some people are even in favor of predatory journals, and they argue that if authors have difficulty in publishing in higher quality, harder to publish in journals, then why not offer them an outlet? If they feel like they need to publish, then why not let them publish in predatory journals? What's the harm? Well, I would argue that there's three major dangers of publishing in a predatory journal. Firstly, as we've said, the work is not subject to peer review, or if it is, it's only it's subpar peer review, it's insubstantial peer review. So if it's not subject to peer review, then the problems are quite evident, and the COVID-19 pandemic have made it quite clear that there have been articles published in predatory journals, and I'm currently involved in a research project looking at this, that have said, for example, that hydroxychloroquine, which is one of the kind of conspiracy theorists' favorite solutions and treatments of COVID-19, they say that hydroxychloroquine is perfectly harmless and can cure COVID. And we know that that's false, because there's plenty of evidence in really good journals, peer-reviewed journals, that said that there's no benefit, and indeed in some cases it may well be harmful to try to treat COVID patients with hydroxychloroquine. But these articles have been published, and they can be found and they can be read because they haven't gone through peer review and they are open access. So, and people who don't know about predatory journals will see that there are articles that claim to prove the validity of these kinds of treatments, and people won't know the difference. And so that obviously can cause huge problems, not just in terms of those people who try to source drugs like that to try and treat it, but also in terms of the wider point about reducing the faith that people have in scholarly communications, because again, people see that these kinds of research is published, and whether it's published in a predatory journal or whether it's published in Nature, people will just see publishers or journals, and they will start to be suspicious of what's published in journals, when in fact it's only what's published in predatory journals that they should be suspicious about. The second point is that some people will say, oh, well, often there's really good research published in predatory journals, and this is true. However, that really good research, firstly, it could disappear overnight. Legitimate publishers will always undertake to keep access to their articles open forever. So they effectively put them in a safe so that they will always be accessible, and they pay for that. And there are organizations who ensure that every single article published by a legitimate publisher in a legitimate journal will always be accessible into the future. So legitimate publishers pay a fee to enable that. Predatory publishers don't do that. And there are literally thousands of predatory journals out there that have got no content. They may well have had lots of content, but when the predatory publishers move on, they will often take the content down from the journals, because if the more content is on the journal, then the more expensive it is to actually maintain that. Often what we see is that a predatory journal will launch, it will be active for a year or two, and then the organizers will move on. They may well take the content down, but they leave the journal up and live. But the only thing that is live is the payment. So you can pay. If you want to put your article in an empty journal, they will happily take your money from you. So usually it's a PayPal account that they use. So you can use PayPal to pay and submit your article and pay for it to be published, but it won't appear there. So they'll take your money but not do anything else. And there are lots of these empty journals where there used to be content, but now it's gone. So your work could disappear. And finally, even if it is published, so what happens is that these journals, they go to optimization. So search engine optimization means that any article that's published in a journal, in a legitimate journal, will, if somebody does a relevant search on Google, for example, then it will appear high on the Google search. So it will aid discoverability. And publishers spend a lot of time and effort and money ensuring that the SEO, which is all to do with the metadata behind the article, the SEO is up, the metadata is optimized so that it appears as high as possible on the Google search. Now again, predatory publishers don't do any of that. So it's actually very difficult to find content published in a predatory journal. And then if you do, then often that work isn't cited very much because nobody else has seen it and nobody else is aware of it. So even if the work is of good quality, then it will effectively be lost from scholarly communications because people find it difficult to find. So this is what a predatory journal actually looks like. And I just want to point out a couple of things that you should be aware of. So firstly, in the middle there, you'll see the editor-in-chief of this journal is called Margaret Stack, who is a professor of at the University of Strathclyde in the UK. Now, what's interesting about this is that Margaret Stack is a professor who is at the University of Strathclyde, and she is an expert in automobile engineering. The problem is that she is an editor of a completely different engineering journal and a legitimate engineering journal. And this journal has effectively stolen her identity to claim that this well-renowned professor in engineering is the editor-in-chief of their journal. Similarly, the two editorial board members to her left and to her right are real people, and they also are engaged in engineering research, but they've got nothing to do with this journal. So their pictures, and you can see in particular, Margaret Stack's picture is very grainy, and that's because it's just been copied and pasted from the website of Strathclyde University. And if you go to Strathclyde website, you'll probably see that picture in a little bit better shape than it is there. So they, again, if you're engaged in engineering and you see, oh, well, I've heard of her, I've read one of her papers, you may well think that this journal is legitimate because you recognize the editor, but she's not actually the editor of this journal. The second thing to look at is on the top right, you'll see that this journal has an ISSN number. So ISSN is worth knowing that of all the 15,000 journals on our database, around 40% have an ISSN. And sometimes authors think, oh, well, this journal's got an ISSN, International Standard Serial Number, that means it's a legitimate journal. But that's not true. When ISSN assign a number, the only thing that they look at is whether the journal who's requesting the number is an active journal. So if they see evidence that the journal has published any papers, then they will assign a number. They don't make any checks in terms of whether the journal's predatory or not. So as I said, over 40% of the journals in predatory reports have got an ISSN. Most of those are legitimate ISSNs. That doesn't really mean anything. Some of them are actually made up. So even if a journal says it has an ISSN, that's not necessarily true. So I wouldn't even waste your time checking if you see a journal's ISSN. You can check if that journal has been assigned that from ISSN, but that doesn't really tell you anything. The third thing to look at and to just identify is that this site looks relatively well designed, but there are certain things on it that are not like other websites. So for example, over on the left, the bottom left there, it says share this page. So often you'll see this on not just the journal website, but any website, the opportunity to share the page on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, or Blogger. However, on the actual page, if you were to hover your cursor over one of those icons, nothing would happen. So this web page hasn't got any kind of sharing functionality. You cannot share this page via those buttons to Facebook or Twitter or anything else. So things like that, if you see that when you look at one of these, then immediately you should be suspicious. Because whilst the journal homepage here looks legitimate, there are things like that that would actually point to, well, actually, no, this is not a legitimate site. This is not a, it's not a genuine journal homepage. So I guess the moral of the story is when you're presented with a journal homepage like this, you need to do a little bit more research. You need to check and find corroborating evidence that the journal, the people are who they say they are. On their university websites, for example, does it say that they're the editor of this journal? Things like that. So, as I said, when in 2017, when we launched Predatory Reports, so we wanted to help authors identify whether a journal was predatory. Now, obviously, Cabells is a commercial organization, so we would like university institutions to subscribe. And if they subscribe, they have access to all of the information for all 15,000 journals. But we also want to help researchers who don't have the access. So for example, we have over 70 criteria that enable us to create the information that you can see there. So there on the example, we've got the Global Journal of Digestive Diseases. So if you're a subscriber, then you see information, for example, that who the publisher is, where the journal is based, what the ISSN is, and things like that. And you'll also see the violations, and those violations are of the 70+ criteria. But those 70+ criteria are all available free on our website. So you can go to Cabells Predatory Reports, and you yourself can look through those predatory behaviors and apply them yourself. So for example, using the example of the predatory journal there, then you can see, okay, if you were looking on the left-hand side, for example, you could look at indexing and archiving and look at whether whatever journal, whatever indexes this journal claims to be part of, is that actually true? Whatever university the authors and the editors claim to be, are they there? Or is there corroborating evidence that they're actually in this? We tend to have, of those 70+ criteria, we rank them in terms of seriousness, and the most serious violations will mean that we include the journal in predatory reports. So one violation, for example, is essentially identity theft. So they say that their editor is their editor, but in actual fact, the editor is not. And that kind of identity theft would be rated as a serious violation, and that would mean that we would almost certainly include the journal in predatory reports. But you yourself can use those criteria to do your own research. And as I said, the indicators are kind of weighted in 3 levels. So those levels are, you can see which levels are the most serious, which you can use yourself. So I've got the URL there at the bottom. So if you go to Cabells.com selection policy, then you'll see all of the different criteria, all of the different weightings, so that you can make your own decision if you've got questions about a journal. Now, one of the main methods that predatory journals and predatory publishers use to try to trick authors and to try to get authors to publish in their journals is through spam email. Now, I'm sure most, if not all of you, have such emails on a fairly regular basis. I've only published 3 or 4 articles, and I tend to get 1 or 2 a week. And what's quite ironic is that the journal that I get most spammed by is the one on the top left there, the International Journal of Business and Economics Research, which, for confirmation, is a predatory journal, and it is on predatory reports. So I will get an email from them about once every 2 weeks, and it's always a different person from the same organization, and that's another thing. Why would you have a different person every 2 weeks? So they kind of change the names that they use. Obviously, there isn't a person who's doing this. This is just done by machine, and they just send these emails out to literally millions of people on a cycle, and that's why it's a spam email. And what's particularly ironic is that the predatory journal was attracted to my paper entitled "Publishing in an Environment of Predation." So I published an article a couple of years ago on predatory publishing, and this predatory journal is saying that they were attracted to that. So obviously, a human being hasn't been involved in this process. It's all done by computer. They have a huge illicit list of people who published. Then they have a huge list of those of article publications, and then they just spam as much as possible. And all they need is a very, very small percentage of people to say, "Oh, okay, well, I'm actually working on a paper now. Maybe I'll submit." And once they kind of, it's like a fisherman or a fisherwoman with a rod. That once they kind of they throw the bait into the river, all they need is that little bite, and then they'll kind of reel them in, and they'll make a few $100s. And they just need that to happen a few times every time they send out the email, and they'll make thousands and thousands of dollars. So we've got some examples here of different journals, and you'll notice that the one on the bottom left there is not a predatory journal. So Indoscience Publishers is a legitimate publisher based in Switzerland, but you'll notice that their the journal title, International Journal of Economics and Business Research, is very similar to the predatory journal at the top, the International Journal of Business and Economics Research. And this is another trait that predatory journals will use a very similar name to an established journal to try to attract authors. And one thing they also do is that they will often call their journal the American Journal of something, or the British Journal of something. And the reason they do that is because an American journal or a British journal immediately sounds like it has some kind of gravitas, some kind of weight, some kind of importance, because the UK and the US are, probably the two most well-known and most established research countries in the world. Interesting fact for everybody, in our journalytics database, we have around 200 journals that have the word British in. In our predatory database, we have nearly 700 journals with the word British. So in actual fact, if you are approached by a journal that has the word British in, it is more than 3 times likely to be predatory than to be legitimate. Now, obviously, you shouldn't judge your submission on the country that a journal says it is based in, but what you should do is be suspicious if the journal is saying that it is the British journal or the American journal. In reality, particularly in America, there are very few journals that are the American journal of something. Often those are just a journal of or review of, and they don't have the American descriptor. So that's just another trait that you should be aware of. So what we would always say, and we're going to get on now to kind of strategies that you can use. The first strategy, which I've been talking about already, is to research your research. So in other words, everybody here is what you might call a professional researcher. So you're authors, you're researchers, you are highly intelligent and very well used to researching whatever it is that your research subject is. Now, what you need to do in order to avoid publishing in a predatory journal is to use all of your skill as researchers and simply shift that from whatever your subject area is to whichever journal you want to publish in. And very quickly, you'll be able to use all of your skills to identify which are the good journals and which are the bad journals. And here is just an example, but there are hundreds of articles out there to help you as researchers to understand exactly what predatory journals are, what they do, and perhaps most importantly, how active they are in your subject area. So we've got articles here. So for example, there's an article based on India, and there's a particular problem of predatory journals in India. So it would help to actually do research in that if you were an Indian researcher. And there's pretty much in every single subject area, there will be numerous articles where somebody has done research about predatory publishing in your subject area. And that can really help you understand not only which journals are guilty of this, but also what traits they have and what kinds of things that they want to publish. And that will help you identify them and hopefully avoid falling into the trap. Another tactic that you can use is identifying journals on what are called safe lists. So a safe list is some kind of ranking or some kind of list of journals or index where things have been legitimately checked so that you can trust any journal that appears on that list. Now, obviously, I'm going to say that Cabells has a safe list in our journalistics database. And there's just an example here of a journal called Accounting and Finance. So this is a very good journal published by Wiley, one of the world's biggest publishers, and it has numerous data points that show that this is a legitimate journal. It has a sponsor, which is a society in Australia and New Zealand. It has a relatively low acceptance rate of 15 to 20%. The average acceptance rate across all journals is probably 30 to 35%. So anything less than that, anything less than 1 in 3 articles accepted is higher than average. It has a certified double-blind peer review process, and we know it's certified because that's what Cabells do in our journalistics database. We request evidence of double-blind peer review or whatever peer review is being done on the journal, and only when we're satisfied that double-blind peer review is legitimate will we include that journal in the database. But we're not the only operator. Many of you will have heard of Web of Science. Web of Science do something very similar. They have a large database of around 13,000 journals. They're the journals with the impact factors. So Web of Science would say they are the very elite, the best journals across all subject areas. And that's a safe list as well. A much bigger list is Scopus. Scopus currently has around 35,000 articles. 35,000 journals, and it's easier for a journal to be accepted into Scopus than it is into journalistics or Web of Science, but there's lots of checks and balances that go through, and Scopus say that there are no predatory journals at all on their database. Similarly, DOAJ, or the Directory of Open Access Journals, there was some concern a few years ago that they had predatory journals, but now it's also, they've tightened up their procedures, and now I don't think there are any predatory journals on DOAJ. So all of these would be what we call safe lists. So as well as doing what you can to check if a journal is predatory, whether it's included on the predatory reports database or whether it exhibits predatory behaviors, you can also check if a journal is on a safe list and make extra specially sure that whatever journal you're interested in is not predatory and is a good journal for your research. Another strategy you can have is to have some kind of framework. Now, a couple of years ago, I presented to a research integrity conference on what we call the Fourfactor framework. And this is essentially a two-step process, which is what I've just been describing. The first step is, okay, the journal that I'm interested in, is it predatory? So that's what we might call a negative check. So can we look at whether it's a bad journal or not? If we identify that it's not, then we look at the kind of more positive aspects to make sure that it's not just a legitimate journal, but it's also the right journal. And we would say that there are 4 factors that you should be really sure of. Strategic, so does this suit your career your career aspirations? Is it useful? Does it include will it include data that you can report on? Does it include the right kind of journal community? So is it people that you're aware of? Is it maybe at a conference that you know about? These are the kind of strategic factors that you should be aware of. There are environmental factors. So for example, are you particularly concerned about research impact? Do you want to make sure that the journal publishes other articles that are, for example, focused on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or are focused on things of issues around equity, inclusion, and diversity, that kind of thing. Indeed, is it open access? Is that something that you feel that you must have? Well, that's the environmental factor. Then there's also political factors, which is a little bit more kind of nuanced, and it's very much down to the individual. But essentially what this means is, in terms of my career, is this a good move? So this is where things like rankings may come into play, because if you believe that if you publish in a journal that's going to help your career in the next 5 to 10 years, then fine, that's definitely a factor you should be aware of. And finally, there are cultural factors. Obviously, the language is important. Do you want to publish in an English language journal? Do you want to publish in a Spanish or a Portuguese journal? Is it a journal that is focused on quantitative types of research, or qualitative or critical? There's all sorts of range of different research, and it's important that, for example, if you have a qualitative study, then you don't send it to a quantitative journal, because it simply won't get accepted. And it could be the best qualitative paper ever written, it won't get accepted in a journal that focuses on quantitative types of research. So this is really important, because there are probably other factors as well, but it's really important that you have a strategy and you have a framework that you can use and that you can trust, because that will help you not just in your immediate career, but in your future career, because you can mold the strategy to whatever is really important to you. But I would always say, it's whatever that strategy is, whether it's like this or something different, it's really important to have a strategy in the first place. So another thing that you might want to do is to kind of bring all of this together and actually use a kind of mix and match approach. So for example, you can evaluate journals using your dimensions, or the kinds of things that are important to you. So they may well be, okay, who is the audience and who's going to read it? What's actually published in the journal? How good is it? Is it peer reviewed? Can I trust it? Are there policies that are aligned and agree with where I'm publishing, the university that I'm involved in? Are essentially the publication practice legitimate? So for example, you could use both negative predatory reports or other lists or other ways of identifying predatory journals, and use safe lists and bring those together in order to kind of create a short list of where you want to publish. So again, what I'm suggesting is that not that you do this thing or you do that thing, but you do something that is right for you. But it's probably better to have perhaps something where you've got one or two different activities that you can develop and that you can engage with, rather than nothing at all. Because as you probably know, just like I said before about researching your research, you've got to be methodical about it, have a methodology. And if you don't have the right methodology, then everything that you're doing there, then it could really come undone. So the final strategy I'm going to share with you is, and we'll finish in the next 2 or 3 minutes, is around new innovations. And it's really important that if you're able to, is to identify innovations that are out there. So a new innovation, for example, that Cabells is involved in, but there are lots of different innovations out there at the moment, is we've partnered with a company called Edifix. And what Edifix do is that they check references. So another potential problem with predatory journals is not you as an author publishing in a predatory journal. You may well publish your research in a legitimate journal, but there may still be a problem, because how do you know that the research that you've used and that you've used in your reference section that you've cited, how do you know that all of the research that you've used is also from legitimate journals? So we've recently worked with Edifix, and what we found out in that roughly of all the articles that Edifix has looked at, around 1 in 10 of the articles has at least one reference that is from a predatory journal. So all of the references, all of the articles that they have looked at are being submitted to legitimate journals. But as I said, about 1 in 10 of the articles include at least one reference that is from a predatory journal. And this is something that's called citation contamination. And unfortunately, it's only, just by sheer weight of numbers, it's only going to get bigger, because as more and more research is published from predatory journals, then the likelihood is that more and more of that research will be cited. Now, articles published in predatory journals tend to be cited a lot less than articles published in legitimate journals, for the reasons I said before about discoverability, etc. But that doesn't mean that they're not cited. They're just cited less than legitimate articles are. And so this is another thing for you to be wary of. And luckily, there are solutions out there that are starting to address this problem. But it will serve you well to kind of look at what are the latest trends in scholarly communications, to kind of read some scholarly communications blogs, to understand more about how scholarly communications work. You'll see things like these new innovations, and hopefully you'll be able to employ them and adapt them to your own research programs and avoid publishing in the dreaded predatory journal. So just to summarize, I've made, broadly speaking, 5 strategies that will help you fight back against predatory journals. Increasing your awareness to understand how they work, being a little bit smart in terms of understanding and applying what you know to how scholarly communications work, and that may mean doing a bit of research on it. Employing your research expertise to understand how to choose the right journal, to use some kind of framework that you can depend on for your strategy, and also to use current tools to help you keep up to date with what's going on and to optimize whatever publishing strategy you've got. So I'm glad to say that's the end of the presentation. If I've gone a little bit over, I'm sorry, but I believe we should still have some time for questions and answers.
Hi, Simon. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. We do have some questions I want to share the first with you, and that question comes from a dear friend, a great researcher based in Colombia. He says, thanks for the presentation. Journals and publishers like his sites and DPI, I think, are part of the Web of Science and Scopus. But we do know that some of those publications are scam, and they do count for researchers' indicators such as citations. And in his country, which is Colombia, the Ministry of Science do use the Web of Science and Scopus as a reference, and I believe that journal is listed there, I guess. So how can we fight against that? Thank you.
Okay, so firstly, I think, so the question is about specifically journals and publishers like MDPI, and probably Frontiers also usually gets included in this discussion. So what do we know about MDPI and Frontiers? On the one hand, if I type into Google MDPI, the first phrase, the first word that Google tells me that, you know, kind of preempts me is predatory. So what we know is that Google thinks that if I type in MDPI, the next word I'm going to most likely to type in is predatory, which means that probably a lot of people are typing that in because people want to know if MDPI is predatory. So we know that Google algorithms think that there's a link between predatory journals and MDPI. But we also know that there is no MDPI journals on predatory reports, and there are no Frontiers journals on predatory reports. So Cabells, as the pretty much expert on all things predatory, do not think that MDPI and Frontiers are predatory. The third thing we know is that whilst some MDPI and Frontiers journals are indexed by Scopus and Web of Science, no MDPI or Frontiers journals are indexed by Cabells. So that also means that Cabells do not think that their MDPI and Frontiers journals qualify for its index. And so put all of that together, then what you can conclude is that there are some operators like Web of Science and Scopus who think that MDPI and Frontiers are legitimate and deserve to be indexed in their database. But there are other operators such as Cabells who obviously are unsure whether they should be included, but definitely do not think they are predatory. And this is the problem that MDPI and Frontiers have. It's a reputation problem, because people out there think that they are predatory, but as you know, as I'm sitting here today, Cabells does not think they are predatory. We do not include any of their journals on our predatory database. So the challenge for authors is not whether to publish in MDPI because they are sanctioned by the Ministry of Science because they include all Web of Science and Scopus journals. If Web of Science and Scopus think they're legitimate and the Ministry of Science thinks Web of Science and Scopus are legitimate, then you can trust that pathway and you can publish your articles in MDPI and Frontiers. You should not be worried about that, because your political framework, going back to the framework we had before, your political framework supports publication in those journals. The problem is that you're aware that they have a bad reputation. And unfortunately, that reputation is because both of those publishers were included in Beals List. But as I've said, I do not believe Beals List itself was a legitimate list. But the reputation is, unfortunately, has been tainted because both of those publishers were included in Beals List, and currently Cabells disagrees with Beals List because we don't include any of their journals on predatory reports. So the answer to the question is, don't worry about publishing in those journals. Plenty of people do, particularly MDPI is growing very, very quickly. One thing you should know about those publishers, from somebody who's worked in publishing, is that they are so far ahead of other publishers in the efficiency of their editorial operations. They are light years ahead of other publishers. They are so much quicker in publishing articles. And whenever publishers go to authors and ask them, what is the number one thing you want to change about publishing your article? The number one thing that authors say is speed to publication. They want faster publication. And this is why predatory journals are so attractive, because they will publish like that. But it's also why MDPI Frontiers are attractive, because they also publish very quickly. The difference is that they do peer review. And the only question mark really is, is that peer review robust enough? It's not a question of whether they do it or not. They definitely do peer review. It's whether it's robust enough. And unfortunately, they have a bad reputation, so people think it's not robust, but they don't have any evidence to support that. So it's up to individual authors to make that choice. But if your Ministry of Science and Web of Science think that a journal in your area is good, and they give credit for that, then that's fine.
Thank you, Simon. Very complete answer. There's another question, and it has to do with journalytics, the services that Cabells provide. And the question is actually, what's the cost for the subscription, and what people can expect from journalytics? Okay,
so if you share your details, with Andre, I'm sure Andre will send them to me, and we can arrange a quotation. Unfortunately, there isn't a standard price, because it depends on the size of your institution. It depends on how many full-time academics are based at your institution, and it also, in terms of what you can expect. So Journalytics currently is more than 11,000 journals in a large database, but we actually divide the database up into 6 subject areas. So for example, if you are a business school, then we have around 3,000 business and management related journals. So you instead of if you're a business school, then you won't be interested in our collection of psychology journals, for example. You can simply subscribe to a smaller set, and obviously a smaller set is cheaper than the whole set. Or indeed, if you're a psychologist, then you might want to just look at our psychology and psychiatry journals, and you won't be bothered with business and management journals. So you can either subscribe to the big Journalytics database of 11,000 journals, or we divide that up into lots of smaller sets depending on what the institution likes. But if you pass your details on to Andre, then hopefully he'll send that to me and won't ask for commission.
I'll do that. Thank you everyone for the questions. We still have time for the last one, which is going back to your session, Simon, and to the first question. So this last one says, what's your opinion about mega journals?
It's a good question. So mega journals are usually journals like PLOS One, or Public Library of Science, or the biggest journal, which is Scientific Reports. To give you some context, in 2020, Scientific Reports published, I think it was 27,000 articles in a single journal. And the reason they were able to do that is because they have a slightly different peer review process than a kind of traditional journal. They have something that's called a light touch peer review. And because the PLOS journals and Scientific Reports and some other of the mega journals, they publish lots and lots of papers, and what they do is that instead of going through a full peer review, firstly they will check that there's no plagiarism or any problems with the journal that's the article in terms of the ethics, and secondly they will check that the scientific research being shared is valid. So basically, the articles published in those journals tend to be very short, and they will be okay, and essentially they will be a bit like the science reports that we did at school. There will be apparatus, method, results, conclusion, and they'll be very short, and essentially they will be, there's a problem, we did some research, we did an experiment, this is the results are either positive or negative, end of article. And what those mega journals are able to do is to do a very, very quick check about, okay, essentially they're saying 2 + 2 = 4. Does 2 + 2 actually equal 4? Yes, it does. If 2 + 2 = 5, it will be rejected. If it equals 4, then they'll say, yeah, this is scientifically valid, and therefore we'll publish it. Now, it may not be scientifically interesting. It may not make a significant contribution to the body of knowledge, which is the typical question that peer reviewers will ask themselves when they review an article. So they kind of take that, if you like, the human element out of it, but they retain the scientific element. So articles published in mega journals will be scientifically valid, but may not be scientifically interesting. And that's one of the reasons why they're able to publish huge numbers, and also why, for example, the impact factors of mega journals are very low, because they have lots and lots of articles that are published that are not cited at all. Now, to give you the complete opposite example, there's a journal called Cancer for Clinicians, which has the highest impact factor, and its impact factor this year is something ridiculous, like 400, which is almost 100 times greater than anything else. And the reason why it has such a high impact factor is because it publishes 20 articles. But those 20 articles are just about the 20 most citable articles in one of the most citable subject areas, which is cancer research, you can have. So this is really is the top, very, very small number of highly citable articles. And as a result, it has a huge impact factor and goes through really, really long, complex peer review processes. So those are the two other ends of the scale. Now, in terms of journalytics, we actually currently do not include PLOS journals or scientific reports. And that's not because we don't think they're good journals or because what they do is in any way bad. It's just that in terms of our criteria, have always been based on robust peer review. And so we prefer to see not a light touch peer review, but a robust, strong, multi-layered peer review. So only journals that satisfy that will get included. And that's another reason why we don't include MDPI or Frontiers journals at the moment, is that we simply haven't seen the evidence. Those publishers haven't given us the evidence to show what type of peer review they do. Whereas all the other publishers that are included in journalytics, they have given us the evidence. So we're able to make a decision about whether the peer review is robust or not. And that really is a core element of why we choose the journals that we do to be included in journalytics. So currently we don't include the mega journals, but that's not because they're bad. It's simply because they have this light touch peer review, which is not, that doesn't corroborate with the criteria that we have for journalytics at the moment.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's the end of the session, and it was a pleasure to listen to you, to learn from you. And I want to invite Valeria to share our final words.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, I had to change rooms. I have so much noise here, so I'm going to be very briefly. Thank you very much, Simon, for your time. And I was very happy when I heard about your ebook. So send that to us. We're going to be very happy to promote it and send this as much as we can. I'm sure this will be great for everybody. So really appreciate all your words, and we learned a lot today. And thank you very much for the organization, and thank you for all the attendees. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.